glad you're here. If you have your Bible or your phone, I want you to turn to 1 Peter chapter 4. We'll be in chapter 4, 1 Peter. While you're turning there, I want to tell you about something that I am really excited about. So if you've ever spent much time reading the Gospels, then you know that Jesus was a great storyteller. That was one of the things that he was best at, in addition to a whole long list of other things that he was really good at. But he was really great at taking stories that everybody could identify with and using them as a means of pointing out some spiritual truth. As we approach the Christmas season, there are already several stories that people in our culture are already deeply familiar with. We call them Christmas movies. So starting next Sunday, as we go through the end of the year, through the Christmas season, we're going to be using some popular Christmas movies like Home Alone, A Christmas Carol, The Grinch, and It's a Wonderful Life as springboards to help us tell the real Christmas story. We're calling it Christmas at the Movies. You can see the graphic there. We're going to have movie clips. We're going to break out the popcorn machine one Sunday. I'm not going to tell you in advance which Sunday, so you have to come all of them to find out. But we're really excited about this. Now, we're not going to be preaching about the movies, but we are going to use selected scenes as a means of pointing us to the real story. So I hope you'll be here for that. It's also a great time of year to invite some people. Say, hey, my church has got a popcorn machine, and they're going to bring it out, and it'll be fun. So great opportunity to invite some people to that, so I hope that you'll do that. Now, as we get started today, I have a picture I want to show you. This is Haley Carruthers. She's 26 years old. In her professional life, she works as a research radiologist for the National Health Services in Great Britain. About 4 years ago, Miss Carruthers was looking for a hobby to take up. She needed something to sort of decompress, take her mind off her work. So she started running, which if I'm looking for a hobby, that's not what I'm doing, but that's what she chose to do. After being stuck in a research facility all day, she thought this would be a great way to relieve some stress and keep myself in better physical conditions. So like most people, she started out with some light jogging. It wasn't long though until she worked her way up and did some distant running. And she earned a reputation not just as an avid runner, but she very quickly became an elite runner. She started running marathons. Now, if you're unfamiliar with these are races in which a person actually volunteers to run 26.2 miles. Now, some of you may have done that. I know we had some folks in the first service. If you're a person that's run a marathon, I want you to know the rest of us salute you. We are just thrilled for you. But I can't imagine what it would be like to do that for fun. 26.2 miles. And earlier this year, you might have seen Miss Carruthers. Now, to put this lightly, she's become an increasingly competitive runner. She's ranked 12th in the rankings in Great Britain today. She's the only woman in the top 25 that still works a full-time job. The rest of them are all full-time runners. But back on April 28th of this year, she participated in the London Marathon, which is sort of like the Boston Marathon is here. It's an old, historic, very competitive race. 40,000 runners come from all over the United Kingdom to participate in this race. And as the race began, she started out well. She was on track to break her personal best of 2 hours, 48 minutes, and 7 seconds. In fact, halfway through the race, she was on track to maybe compete for a top 5 finish, which would be incredible considering the elite competition that she was up against. Unfortunately, though, around the 20th mile, something went wrong. She described it to the BBC News saying, "My legs got heavy. I started counting my steps. My head was gone. I lost sight in one eye. I just could not lift my legs at all, and I couldn't move. It was petrifying." Now, can you imagine trying to run when you've already lost sight in one eye? Because she's such a competitor, though, she decided she was going to do her best to finish the race. And 6 miles later, as she approached the finish line, about 10 yards short of the line, she collapsed. And from there, she literally crawled on her hands and knees for the next 10 yards, where the doctors and paramedics were waiting for, just across the finish line. When it's all said and done, even though she collapsed before finishing, she still finished 18th, and still set a personal record of 2 hours, 31 minutes, and 53 seconds. Now, admittedly, I'm not much of a runner, but we can all identify with the frustration of having a goal, getting to where your goal is in sight, only to have something happen just before you cross the finish line. So as I watched this clip of this past week, and you can look this up, I noticed something I thought was interesting. Now, in most sports, you know how it works. You go to the gym, you go to the stadium, and you cheer for one team, and if you're really into it, you might boo the other guys. You know what I mean? You're not going to cheer for both teams. But what happens in running is that the people who line the streets, the crowd, the fans, wherever they are, while they might have one or two people that they're there, cheering for in particular, they pretty much cheer for everybody. Everybody that goes by, they sort of clap their hands and they cheer. And you can hear the crowd when she went down 10 yards short of the finish line, as she crawled on her hands and knees, the crowd literally goes crazy. People are cheering for her, they're clapping, they're shouting, they're whistling. And it doesn't seem to work that way in other sports, but for some reason in running, even the other competitors cheer for one another. And as you watch the clip, the closer she gets, the harder it gets, the more they cheer. And it's almost as if the cheers of the crowd and the encouragement that came from her fellow runners was enough to get her across the finish line. For the last few weeks, we've been talking about how as followers of Jesus, you and I can train ourselves to hear and recognize the voice of God on a consistent basis. We talked about eliminating distractions, how to read the Scripture, and how to build time into your schedule to listen to God. But today, we want to talk about another way that God often speaks to His people, and that's through the voices of other people. A lot of different ways God speaks, but one of the clearest ways He speaks is through the voices of other people. So if you're following along on your outline or in the app, here's the key truth we want you to unpack a little bit today. In order to hear God's voice, I have to hang out with God's people. In order to hear His voice, I have to eliminate distractions. I have to read His book. I have to spend some time listening to Him. But I also have to train myself to hang out with some of His people. Now, one of the things we keep stressing throughout this series is how important it is, if you're a follower of Jesus, to read your Bible on a consistent basis. And one of the things you discover when you read about these early followers of Jesus is just how often God used imperfect, normal people like you and me to deliver His message into the lives of other people. Sometimes it's a word of encouragement when it's needed most. Other times it's a stinging rebuke when somebody's taken a wrong turn. But it's amazing how often God used imperfect messengers to deliver His message at the perfect time. For example, you go back to the Old Testament, Moses had his brother Aaron, King David had a prophet named Nathan, Esther had Mordecai, Elisha had Elijah. You get to the New Testament, Timothy had Paul, and on it goes. And it was the great poet John Donne who said that no man is an island. And what he meant by that is that none of us are going to get to the point where God wants us to be without the help and encouragement and correction of other people. But there's a challenge in this, and it's this. It's much easier not to do this than it is to do this. And the reason that's the case is because of a universal truth that holds true in any time period, in any place, across any culture, and it's this. People are crazy. And because people are crazy, they have the potential to drive you crazy. Some of you have had that experience. We all know that that's true. If you're not careful, the more you get involved with other people, the crazier your life can become. For example, we get to this time of year, and for a lot of you, you're looking forward to the holidays. You're going to spend some time, sitting around the table, and it's going to be a great experience eating a home-cooked meal. Some of you spend all year looking forward to these next few days. Others of you, though, even the thought of that causes your blood pressure to rise a few points, causes your anxiety level to go up. For a lot of people, family gatherings are kind of like a Hallmark movie. Everybody's dressed up and they're smiling and there's no tension and the room is decorated beautifully and the food's presented beautifully and it's just a great experience. And if that describes your situation, be thankful for that. Because for most people, it's not that way. For a lot of people, family gatherings are more like World War III than they are a Hallmark movie. Might start out okay, but normally it doesn't take long until the fighting starts. Somebody brings up the wrong topic, somebody says the wrong thing, tempers flare, all of a sudden everybody's at each other, and you start relitigating old grievances. They argue over politics, they debate current events. Sometimes they even argue over religious preferences, and people get mad, and feelings get hurt, and before you know what happened, what started out as a nice family, peaceful family meal quickly becomes the latest round in a never-ending family feud. And for some people, being around their family is a life-giving, joy-inducing experience. For a lot of other people, it can be an exhausting experience. And here's the kicker. What's true of your family is also true of the church. Only instead of having 30 or 40 people at a family reunion, you've got 300 or 400 people. And see, since a church is made up of people, and people are crazy, that means that anytime you get involved in a group of people in a church, there's always the potential for misunderstandings, for frustration, for differences of opinion, and even conflict. So that begs the question, is it worth it? Is getting involved with other people worth the risk and the hassle that it sometimes can cause? And for a lot of people in our culture, they answer that question by saying, no, it's not worth it. And they've adopted the approach that spirituality is a personal thing, so rather than doing it with other people, I'm just going to do it on my own. So while you might choose to attend a Bible study, they listen to a podcast. You get up on a Sunday morning, you come to a worship service and you sing, they go to the golf course and pray, or cuss and pray, and some combination of those things. You come to a connect group, they hang out on their boat or in a deer stand in the woods, and if you talk to them about it, they will quickly tell you that they think it's easier for them to connect with God doing those things than it is to be involved in the lives of other people in a church. And in some ways, maybe they're right. There is something attractive about isolating yourself and finding creative ways to connect with God apart from getting involved with a bunch of messed up people. Last week we looked at the example of Jesus, how often he withdrew from the crowds. He spent some time alone with God, and we talked about how that's an important part of his daily routine, should be a part of your daily routine. But what you discover when you read those stories, that every time Jesus pulled back, he immediately came back, and what did he do? He engaged with the people. Even though he pulled back, he always re-engaged with the crowds. That's the pattern you see over and over again. And Jesus understood that while a person's spiritual life is deeply personal, it was never meant to be private. It was always meant to include relationships with other people. And one of the reasons that's true is because often God speaks through the voices of other people. Yes, there's some things you only hear in the silence of solitude, but there's some other things you only hear in the crowd. The question then is, how do you build the kinds of relationships with other people that God can speak through? 1 Peter chapter 4, the Apostle Peter, who was sort of the unofficial leader of the apostles, talks about this. Just set this up for you. Peter is writing this to a group of people who have been living under intense persecution. Because of that, they've been scattered to all these different places throughout the Roman Empire. And as you read through this letter, there are two big themes that Peter keeps returning to again and again: suffering and community. He knows these people are suffering. They've lost their homes. Many of them had to flee from their businesses, their jobs. Their families have been scattered. So they know what it means to suffer. And then he keeps bringing up community, because he knows in order for them to survive, they're going to have to do it together. They suffer together, but they also survive together. Then you get to chapter 4, starting in verse 7. He describes how to build the type of community that can withstand all of the challenges they're going to have to face. Check out what he says in verse 7. The end of all things is near. Therefore be alert and of sober mind, so that you may pray. Above all, love each other deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sins. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Each of you should use whatever gift you've received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. If anyone speaks, they should do so as one who speaks the very words of God. If anyone serves, they should do so with the strength that God provides, so that in all things God may be praised through Jesus Christ. To him be the glory and the power forever and ever. Amen. It's interesting. Peter starts us out and he says, hey, what's what you know? The end of all things is near. And we've been talking about that some on Wednesday night, how for these early followers of Jesus, they were convinced that Jesus really could come back at any moment. They got up every day with the expectation that that day could be the day that Jesus returned. But it's interesting, whenever you read in the New Testament where they talk about the events surrounding the return of Jesus, they never talk much about the timing of it. Instead, they talk about the necessity of being prepared for it. So what Peter does here, he says, yeah, hey, the end's near, but instead of talking about when it's going to happen and how it's going to happen, he immediately begins talking about how you prepare for it. And from his perspective, one of the ways you prepare for the end, whether you're talking about the end of the world or the end of your life, is not by withdrawing. It's not by pulling back from relationships. It's by leaning into those relationships and going deeper in those. It's by building and investing in relationships with other followers of Jesus. So he goes on here and he tells us 3 ways we can build those types of relationships. Here's the first one. He says, you lead with love. Above all else, love each other deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sins. As I said earlier, in a family, there are all kinds of things that people fight over. In a church family, you sometimes have the same thing. Think about all the different things that people could potentially divide over. Last Sunday night was the community Thanksgiving service at First Baptist. Many of you were there. There were 5 or 6, other churches involved and participated. And whenever you plan those services, I'm just telling you, it's really hard to know what to do. Because you got people coming from all kinds of different perspectives, all kinds of different backgrounds. Some are really emotional, some are a little more reserved, some are really contemporary, some are a little more traditional. And it's hard to know what to do so that everybody can participate. They have different worship styles. They prefer different preaching styles. They use different Bible translations. They dress differently. Sometimes they even believe different things when it comes to certain issues. So how do you plan a service where everybody can participate? Same thing happens here on a regular basis. When you have as many people involved in your church as we do, you have all kinds of difference of opinions, all kinds of different preferences. So however many people you have, that's how many opinions you have. So when you think about it, there are literally hundreds of different things that a church could divide over. Worship styles, music preferences, political opinions, sports rivalries, business rivalries, ministry. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. So what is it that keeps us together? According to Peter, it's our love for Jesus and our love for each other. John 13, the Apostle John said it this way. He said, a new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you're my disciples if, and sometimes that's a big if you love one another. According to John, the one thing that we should be known for above and beyond everything else is our love for one another. It's our love that enables us to overlook offenses, look past disagreements, keep no record of wrongs, and join together to reach our community. One of my favorite writers is a guy named C.S. Lewis. He served for decades as a professor of literature at Oxford, wrote numerous books, including the classic The Chronicles of Narnia. Lewis became a Christian at the age of 32. But to be honest, by his own admission, he never enjoyed going to church. Now, that may surprise you, or maybe you can relate to that. I don't know. But he never really enjoyed it. In his own words, he thought the sermons were boring, the people got on his nerves, and he hated the music. Now, I want you to listen to how he described, in his own words, the music that a lot of people today consider to be, the gold standard of music, the hymns from the 1930s through the 50s. Listen how he described them. He called them fifth-rate poems set to sixth-rate music. And that's what he thought about the hymns that so many of us look back at. So here's the question. Why did he go? I mean, he didn't like the sermons, he didn't like the people, and he hated the music. So there's not much left after you get rid of those three things. So why did he go? In his own words, he went because he believed that if he didn't go, he would fall into something he called solitary conceit. Now, you know what solitary confinement is? Solitary conceit, the way he described it, is when you fall into the trap of thinking that you've got all the answers. And you don't need anybody to help you because you've already figured all this out. And C.S. Lewis knew that's always a dangerous place to be. According to Peter, it's our love for God and our love for one another that covers over a multitude of sins. What's that mean? It means that as we learn to love one another, as we learn to forgive one another, as we refuse to hold each other hostage because of past mistakes, that God extends that same grace to us. So if you want to build these types of relationships that God can speak through, it starts with learning to love one another above and beyond everything else. Here's the second thing that Peter says. We can build these kinds of relationships through practicing hospitality. Verse 9, he says, offer hospitality without grumbling. Now, in some ways, in a lot of ways, it's easy to love people from a distance. You know what I mean by that? It's easy for me to love people that I don't have to hang out with, right? It's easier for me, just being honest, to love my neighbor if I stay in my house and he stays in his house and we don't ever have to talk. We can just wave at each other, as we pass by. That part is easy. What gets hard is when you have to spend time with people. Now, in a church setting, research has shown that you're probably only going to form relationships with 20, 30, maybe up to 40 people. That means in a church like ours, 2 services, a lot of people, there's going to be a lot of people that you don't know. You might recognize their face, but you're not going to know them. You may not know their name, probably don't know anything about them. And that's okay. You don't have to be close to everybody, but what Peter's describing here is a situation in which you're building deeper relationships with certain people so that you can encourage and challenge one another as you see the end approaching. And the way you do that is through hospitality. Hospitality, here's what it means. The friendly, generous reception and entertainment of guests, visitors, or strangers. In the first century, hospitality was essential to survival. Remember, he's writing this people that have been scattered from their homes. The only hope they have of surviving is if they take care of one another. In the 21st century, might be even more essential. We now live in a world in which, while we're supposedly more connected than ever, at the same time, we're becoming increasingly isolated. People now watch games on their TVs in their house rather than going to the stadiums. There's these services now. You can order your groceries. You can have your favorite meal delivered right to your door. You don't have to go to the mall anymore. You can shop online. Rather than going to the movies, and dropping $40 on a small popcorn and a medium Coke, you can sit in your house, watch the exact same movie. Right now, even in the church world, we have as many people, if not more, on a regular basis watching us online than are actually here. And we're heading towards a day in our culture, if something doesn't happen, where you could conceivably never leave your house. I mean, you could do everything you need to do right from your house. And while that might be convenient, what does it do to relationships? That's Peter's point is that in order to build these types of relationships in which God speaks through people to you, you have to start to know some people. You have to spend some time with people. That's why our Connect groups are so popular. I was thinking about my own group. Over the last few years, we've sat around the table and you cry together and you pray together and you laugh together and you eat together. And because of that, over time, you start to say things to each other that otherwise you might not be able to say. See, for the first 200 years of church history, there were no church buildings. All over the empire, you had these little groups of 20 or 30 people that met in people's homes, and that was how the church got started. And what they lacked in size, they more than made up for in terms of intimacy with God and intimacy with each other. And because of that, they literally changed the course of history. So with that in mind, I want to ask you, who is it that you hang out with? Who is it that you sit around the table with on a consistent basis and you just spend time with one another? Who is it that if they came to you and they started a conversation about your spiritual life, that you would actually listen to them. Who are those people? And if you don't have somebody that comes to mind, or you can't name those people, then it very well could be that that's the missing piece in your spiritual life. It could be the reason you don't hear from God is because you're not hanging out with any of his people. One more thing Peter mentions here. In order to build these types of relationships, we have to serve one another. Now, we all know in the church world that we've been called to use our gifts to serve the people around us. Every Sunday, we gather to worship. It takes 50 or 60 volunteers just to do what we do on a normal Sunday. Bus drivers, door greeters, ushers, kids workers, security team, band members, audio. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. It takes a small army just to do what we do now. But when you get to the end of this paragraph, Peter mentions one gift in particular that we don't normally think about when it comes to spiritual gifts. So I want you to look at this with me. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 10. Each of you should use whatever gift you've received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. Now check out verse 11. If anyone speaks, they should do so as one who speaks the very words of God. If anyone serves, they should do so with the strength God provides, so that in all things God may be praised through Jesus Christ. To him be the glory and the power forever and ever. Amen. Now again, for the most part, we get the serving part, right? We all understand that. But that speaking part can be pretty intimidating. You look at what he says in verse 11, and we think he's talking about preachers and prophets and teachers much more than he's talking about us. I mean, that's not the kind of stuff we could do. We'll just leave that to the professionals. I mean, we're not going to dare to speak for God. He's not talking about us. He's talking about the professionals, right? The preachers and the prophets and the teachers. But what if what he said in verse 11 applied to every follower of Jesus? See, one of the things you have to remember when you read the New Testament is originally written in Greek, and Greek is a much more precise language than English. In fact, they have different words for different things that we use the same word for. So in Greek, you have one word that means preaching, and you have a different word that means like normal conversation. Anybody care to guess what the word is that's used in verse 11? It's not the word for preaching. It's the word for normal conversation. Laleo. And when Peter says that anyone who speaks should do so as if they're speaking the words of God, he's not talking about some preacher standing in front of a congregation. He's not talking about some prophet on a street corner. He's not even talking about a teacher in a Sunday school class. He's talking about followers of Jesus sitting around a table, going through their day-to-day routine and talking to one another. But here's something else. As you read the flow of this passage, I think it's clear that Peter is saying that it's the first two things he mentions that opens the door for this last thing. See, it's the building relationships with people, it's the loving people, it's the practicing hospitality with people that opens the door to actually talking to people. And before you dare to speak for God to somebody else, you better make sure that you're doing those first two things, that you're loving people and you're building relationships with people. See, as Christians, sometimes in our culture especially, we have the reputation that we like to go around and correct everybody else without first taking the time to connect with them. And whenever we do that, instead of drawing them in, we push them away. It's always a recipe for disaster. The better approach, and the one that I think Peter's teaching here, is that before we dare to speak for God, we build those relationships. We take the time to love people and build relationships with people. Let's be honest, it's easier for me, and it's probably easier for you, to sit back and throw truth bombs at people we don't know than it is to take time to actually get to know them before we have the type of conversations about where we are and where we're going. But here's the cool part. When you do this in the right order, when you love people, you get to know people, and then you start talking to people, Peter says when you get this right, people's lives are changed. God gets glorified, and the future is altered. But before any of that happens, we have to do the hard work of loving each other. I have another picture that I want to show you. This was taken at the end of the London Marathon in 2017. In the picture in the middle there, you see 35-year-old David Wyeth. He works as a project manager just outside London. He's also a member of a very prestigious British running club, which I didn't know that was such a thing, but apparently there are clubs where you run. And as a member of that club, he spent months preparing for this London Marathon. He had a specific goal of completing the 26.2-mile run in under 2 hours and 40 minutes. By all accounts, he was on track to do that until just a few miles left to go in the race. He started to get dehydrated. The effects of dehydration began to set in, and he knew that finishing the race would be a challenge. But he'd come that far, so he decided to try to tough it out. And he did everything he could to keep going with about 200 meters to go in the race, which is the length of a little more than 2 football fields. His legs turned to jelly, and he collapsed. 200 meters short of the goal. At that moment, it looked as if his race was over. That was until another runner, the guy you see in the white shirt, Matthew Rees, who was trying to finish the race on his own, decided to stop before he finished the race, pick up Mr. Wyeth, put his arms around his shoulder, and nearly carried him to the finish line. Now, if you go back and watch the video, the crowd's going crazy. I mean, you can see this guy's in a lot of pain. His muscles are beginning to break down. Each step is just a titanic struggle. He's doing everything he can to keep going, but he has this competitor, this other runner who refuses to let him quit. Later that day, Mr. Wyeth was interviewed by a reporter from The Guardian. Here's what he told him. He said, "I really wouldn't have got across the line. On my hands and knees, maybe. But by then, the time meant nothing. Because in the end, I know I wouldn't have got there without Matthew putting his arm around me and carrying me over the line." I read that and I thought, man, I don't know if you'll ever see a better description of what a church is supposed to do than that. And you look back and you say, hey, man, I don't know when the end's coming. But it didn't matter because I'm not getting there if I don't have some help. So I was thinking about this, and to be honest, there have been several times throughout my life, and hopefully you can relate to this, where I've experienced this. I've been on the receiving end of this. There have been a lot of instances in which I felt like quitting, only to have somebody come up alongside me, say the exact right thing at the moment it was needed most. And whether or not they even realized it, man, at that moment, they spoke for God to me. So looking back, there were a lot of things that my grandpa said to me that looking back on it came from God. Now, there were some moments that I didn't want to hear them, but looking back on it, they came from God. I have a friend named Phil, an older guy who I worked with who's much more experienced. And I can't tell you the number of times I've called him on the phone and I've been sort of my wits end, frustrated about some problem or uncertain about some situation, only to have him say the exact thing that I needed to hear. I told him one time, sometimes I feel like hanging up on him, but he always says the right thing. I can remember back when I was first starting out in youth ministry, and I'd been in it about a year, maybe a year and a half, and I wasn't sure this was what I wanted to do. It didn't, in a lot of ways, it didn't seem like it fit who I was. And after a random Sunday service, there was a 17 or 18-year-old girl named Jordan that came up to me and she said, "You know, you're a really good speaker." Now, she probably doesn't remember that, but I do. Because what she didn't know was I had my resignation in my pocket, ready to turn it in. And looking back on it, she probably doesn't even remember that. But in that moment, she spoke for God. Over the last year, many of you have done this for me. It's happened in funeral homes, in hallways, through text messages, at ball games. There have been a lot of moments over the last year where I felt like throwing in the towel and quitting. And you may not remember what you said, but I remember. And my question for some of you here today is, if you're not having that experience, it could be that you're hanging out with the wrong people. See, in order to hear God's voice, I have to hang out with God's people, because one of the ways He speaks clearest is through the voices of other people. So how are your relationships? Are you taking time to build these types of relationships? Are you caught up, the high speed, high distraction, out of control, tunnel vision type lifestyle in which, you may be more digitally connected than ever before, but you also could be as isolated as you've ever been before. And if you are, I want to challenge you, make it a point into the new year, to make it a point to build relationships with other followers of Jesus. Join a core group, become part of a connect group, invite some people over your house for dinner, take them out to lunch, go to a movie, go to a ball game, just do something where you're sitting around the table with the right people, listening for the right voice. I want you to stand. We're going to have just a brief invitation. If you're here this morning and you feel like the Lord has spoken to you, maybe it's a day that you need to make a decision to follow Christ for the first time. We'd love to help you do that. David and I will be here. Others of you may be here. It may mean that God has spoken to you about placing your membership here and joining this family. And I'm just going to tell you, I wish I could promise you it'll always be smooth sailing. It will not. But we're all in this thing together. And I can promise you, if you'll join us, we'll welcome you with open arms. So whatever you need to do, you just meet us on this front row.